Hey, before we dive into the interview, I want to remind you that there's a submission deadline right around the freaking corner for issue 3 of the audio magazine, November 1st. I'd hate to be one of those guys who doesn't get enough submissions. You're like, guess what? Gotta extend the deadline. Because it's looking like that. Theme is heroes. You're going to see a bunch of them trick-or-treating. Not like the kids. They're not heroes, but they're going to be dressed like them. Take it whatever direction you want to go in. Essay is supposed to be no more than 2,000 words. Bear in mind, it's an audio essay, so pay attention to how the words tumble out of your mouth. Email your submissions with heroes in the subject line to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com. Come. I pay writers too. You know that. I've been calling it that fat burrito money because you'll be able to get like 2 Chipotle burritos. Dig it.
And I was like, oh, twist my arm. I love jumping off shit. It's like, it's my jam. So I was like, you found the right writer.
Well, this is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. My voice crack? I hate when that happens. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Kim H. Cross is a freelance features writer, teacher, editor, mountain bike head coach, and just a damn pleasure to be around, man. She's been featured in Best American Sports Writing, the year's Best Sports Writing, the Expansion Team model, for her wildly popular and dissected piece, What Happens When Two Strangers Trust the Rides of Their Lives to the Magic of the Universe, or Noel and Leon. Eva Holland has dissected it. Chip Scanlon has dissected it. Matt Tullis has dissected it. Kim and I gab a little bit about it since we talk about structure, and that piece is a master class in structure gymnastics. It's like the balance beam of structure. She sticks the landing, man. Hence the dissection. But what finally brought Kim into CNF Pod HQ was her new book, The Stahl House, Case Study Number 22 in the Making of a Modernist Icon. It's actually out. Early next week, November 2nd, I believe, is the official publication date. Finally, it's been pushed back. A lot of people's publication dates have been pushed back for reasons that are beyond my comprehension. Kim, like I said, she had a lot of false starts to the publication of this book, so it would appear that it's good to go. I don't know. It's a beautiful book regardless. Even if I did only read it on my internet pad, it's published by Chronicle Chroma. Really beautiful photography in there. I imagine the hardcover of this book is really a gorgeous thing to behold. Well, that's a nice little intro so far. Let's do an ad read. Support for the Creative Nonfiction Podcast is brought to you by West Virginia Wesleyan College's low residency MFA in creative writing. Now in its 10th year, this affordable program boasts a low student-to-faculty ratio and a strong sense of community. Recent CNF faculty include Randon Billings-Noble, Jeremy Jones, and Sarah Einstein. There's also fiction and poetry tracks with recent faculty there, Ashley Bryant Phillips, Jacinda Townsend, as well as Diane Gilliam and Savannah Sipple. So no matter your discipline, if you're looking to up your craft or maybe learn a new one, consider West Virginia Wesleyan right in the heart of Appalachia. Visit mfa.wvwc.edu for more information and dates of enrollment. I should also say, and I'll start plugging it now, on Saturday, November 13th, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern, I will be doing a CNF Pod live, Zoom live, but it's going to be live for a nonfiction conference of sorts, virtual conference for Goucher College, my MFA alum, alma mater. So I will be interviewing Ricky Turner, who has a new book coming out. I've never met Ricky. I haven't read the book yet. But from the 12th to the 14th is a pretty cool virtual conference. I think it's like $20. Don't have the link or anything. I'll put it in the show notes. How does that sound? Good. Kim's one of the good guys. Her work has been featured on Neiman Lab, ESPNW, SB Nation Longform, Southwest Magazine, RIP. I believe that closed down. It's one of the better airline magazines that bit the dust. I think it bit the dust. Someone fact check me. Hank, fact, yeah, he's a dog. Bicycle Magazine, among others. She's the New York Times bestselling author of What Stands in a Storm, a true story of love and resilience in the worst superstorm in history. I feel lucky to call Kim a friend. Though we've never met in person, she does live right next door in Idaho, but it's still a long ways away. Shooting across Oregon on Route 20 in the high desert. Take a while to get there, but maybe we'll fist bump one of these days. So the Stahl house is the biography of a house, and you'll hear names like Buck and Carlotta Stahl, blue-collar people with white-collar dreams, and architect Pierre Koenig and photographer Julia Schulman. They feature heavily in the development of this house and the story of the house. And the Stahl house is one of the most iconic houses in the world, built at the nexus of several factors that were illustrative of America and Los Angeles at large at the time, post-World War II United States. So Kim, along with her co-authors Bruce and Sherry Stahl, Bruce Stahl and his sister Sherry Stahl Gronwald, they spin a warm story about a home. Kim is at Kim H. Cross on Twitter and Instagram. She has a nice newsletter, don't we all now, called Kim's Whims, which the title alone just cracks me up. Not the newsletter, the Kim's Whims is very cute and funny. I like it. Speaking of newsletters, head over to brendanamara.com for show notes and to sign up for my up to 11 monthly newsletter. Been doing it for about 10 years now. Cool links to stuff I think you'll find groovy, man. Exclusive happy hour, book raffles, and more. First of the month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. You're going to love how Kim goes about the work, hearing her 10-year vision plan. We talk a lot about structure. We talk about that book, of course. Lots of stuff. Good things here. And if you're not excited to do some reporting and research and writing when this is all said and done, then go grab your goodie bag and just head on home, okay? So here's Kim. Riff.
Oh my gosh, it's been a really crazy fall. I have like 4 or 5 jobs, and this is the first time I've been able to come up for air since August. So like one of my jobs, and this one is completely volunteer, is I'm the head coach for a high school and middle school mountain bike team.
Nice. I wanted to ask you about that, so I'm glad you're talking about it.
Yeah. And we have, it's a really interesting sport because it's a team sport. But to do it, we have to have adult coaches who are very trained, have wilderness first aid certification and other training, and are able to ride with the kids 3 times a week. And that's a big ask. We have a ratio of like 6 students per instructor. And in order to guide mountain biking safely, you have to have a lot of coaches. And so that's one of the big challenges of it. But it's really also fun because we're not standing on the sidelines. We're actually going on rides with these kids. And it keeps us in shape, and it makes me ride my bike, which is really fun.
Yeah, I had never known that there was actual mountain bike teams in the way that I guess you would have your classic cross country or whatever your fall sport. It's like individual/team sport. I had no idea that existed.
Most people don't, and it's been around for, I can't remember how many years, but in Idaho, I think it's been 7 years now, and we're not, by far the newest league, but there's an organization called NICA. It's the National Interscholastic Cycling Association, and they're trying to get a league in every state, and it's the reason we live in Idaho. Like my husband launched the Alabama League, and it did so well that the national organization asked him to come out and help launch Idaho. And the guy who launched Idaho was kind of a starter who wanted to turn it over to someone to run. So he immediately started recruiting my husband, and that's why we live here. And we have like 1,000 kids in Idaho, more than 1,000 racing mountain bikes, which is really cool. It's a great sport because it's boys and girls on a team. No one gets cut from the team. No one warms the bench, and you don't even have to race in order to be part of the team. So it's really kind of a cool lifelong sport where we get to, get these kids learning more than just riding a bike, but, through bikes.
Nice. Yeah, that's when I was reading one of the essay you wrote in 2013 for ESPNW about the triathlon, the Tri-Cross event you did. You wrote there about most of the lessons, or many of the lessons that you've learned over the years are a result of sports. Actually, I have the quote here. It's like how to suffer, what to practice, what to sacrifice, when to compromise, why teamwork matters, that falling is an art, and that sometimes what you learn from losing can be even sweeter than winning. So it's kind of embedded in that, what you're talking about right now.
Totally.
So what I as sort of a lifelong athlete myself, I can definitely attest to that. But what are some of those lessons from sport that you've overlaid onto your writing career?
Oh, that's a great question. I love this question. It's funny because I think I realized sort of late into my writing career that I approach writing kind of the same way I approach sports. And a lot of the sports that I did were skill sports. So you have to practice something over and over and over, and you have to really put in the time. And then I switched to endurance sports, where you really have to learn how to be uncomfortable for long periods of time, and also kind of build the base that then you can use when you want to increase the intensity. So, one thing I try to apply to my writing life, and sometimes with more success than others, depending on how much time I have, is that you need to practice it before you go out and do it in for real in a game or in competition. And so free writing is a big part of my writing practice. When I have balance in my life, I try to start my day with a little bit of free writing, and I try to, build in time to do stuff that allows me to practice and experiment in a way or in a venue that, doesn't have the pressure of publication. And so I don't know if you want to go down this trail, but some years ago, I taught and co-instructed a writing workshop in Archer City, Texas. And the idea was that we would create kind of a safe space to experiment without the fear of failure and without the pressure of publication. So we would be going out and practicing the craft and sharing it and workshopping it, but it wasn't necessarily, ever going to be published. Sometimes it did get published, but that wasn't the point. The point was if you're a basketball player, you're going to shoot 1 million free throws, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of writers, working writers, you have to really deliberately carve out the time to practice, because it's so easy only to write on demand when you're on deadline and you have an assignment. And so I think that some of my best growing as a writer has been done kind of privately in a notebook. And I really believe in keeping a paper notebook and writing by hand, because I think it taps a different part of my brain, and it allows me to only write forward. You can't edit yourself as you can't self-edit and get in the way of the writing process as much as you can when you're sitting at a computer and you can constantly, hit the backspace key.
Yeah, I think it's so important to see the footprints of a sentence, even if you're going to scratch out words or everything. That's what's so great about longhand, is that it leaves evidence of the mistakes behind. So you're like, oh, okay, I can see what happened here, what I crossed out, what wasn't working. But with a computer, it's like those things get deleted forever, and you never see the progress necessarily because it gets deleted. So, but that's what's so great about I'm just a pencil guy. So pencil on paper, I do a lot of that. So that's such a great exercise.
Oh, that's awesome. When do you do your writing? Do you have a time of day? Is it built into your daily life, or how do you use that?
Yeah, in the morning, early morning, I just right now I've kept a journal since I was 16. So I've had a almost daily journal for, what is that now, 25 years. And so right now my journals are always changing the form. And right now I just use a bunch of field notes notebooks, and I just do 1 or 2 pages in a little field notes notebook in the morning. And it's just little riffs. It's nothing technical or anything. It's just, like you said, kind of free writing. And then at night in my bullet journal, which is kind of like my daily planner / calendar / external hard drive for what's going on in my brain, I do a daily download right before bed that's usually just 3 or 4 sentences about what happened in the day, and I just draw a box around it. So that's kind of like my analog writing journaling practice for the most part right now.
Oh, that's fantastic. I love that you bookend the day with that.
Yeah, it's great to get away from screens and do something that is, truly easy on the eye. But it's also like a signifier that, okay, we're really powering down, and it's bedtime, and there's no more electricity getting beamed into my head.
Ooh, I love that. I love that. That's a great evening ritual. I think I need to take that up again and lock my phone in another room.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love the point you're making too about the getting away from the pressure of publication, but writing is as practice. And there are any number of ways that can manifest itself. You could write poetry or even mess around with screenplays, just in a way of trying on different shoes. But it's all kind of
exactly.
Yeah, it's just I love hearing that, and we don't practice enough. I guess we just kind of go through the motions, whether it be emails or even stories that might be on deadline. You're just like, all right, I know how to write. I have some basic skills. I'm just going to kind of do what I can as fast as I can. But we don't take the time to set up the tee in the basement and take a bunch of swings and maybe mess around with a different path to the ball or a different way of moving. Everything just seems like it is weighed down with that pressure to publish.
Exactly. And if you were an athlete and you only did your sport in competition, how bad would you be?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
I love the idea that, of doing almost drills. And I think, I didn't realize it, I think, until recently that I'd been doing this for years, because when I would go on a trip, I would practice writing scenes and dialogue and capturing all of that kind of in real time. And I would have kind of an everyday carry notebook that I would use to capture dialogue, especially, and just little details that you might forget. And then at the end of the day, I would sit down and practice writing a scene. And some of those things have found their way into essays that I wrote, 7 years after I initially took the notes and did the scene. And I didn't know at the time it would ever, become something else. But it's just kind of funny how like you develop this raw material. And the other thing I've been thinking about a lot, really in the mindset of coaching, since this is my first year as head coach, is that, the same tools that you can use in sports to, develop the neural pathways that you need to, to train in order to do emotion that's complex I think you can do that with writing as well. It's just, you have to do the thing. And by going and writing every day, you're training your brain to be ready to write at that time every day. And I think there's something to be said for that makes it easier when it's time to sit down and do it on assignment or under pressure, is that, it's almost like the muscle is fit and it's ready. It's used to being used. And so it's like, oh, here we go again. And it's the same thing that I'm trying to teach my athletes about, having rituals that they do in practice and doing those same things in practice as they do before a competition, so that, your brain is just kind of primed to go.
Getting to that next level in athletic performance too often takes a great degree of deep study. And this is more true with team sports, but I suspect it is with individual sports, especially, golf comes to mind too, where you might go to the film and you're going to study what the other team is doing or what you guys are doing and how all those pieces are moving together. And that's also something that can be done in the creative fields, and especially movies, but if we're talking literal film. But going to the film as a writer, it's like taking that piece of writing that really clicks with you and then just trying to really deconstruct it. What's going on here? Keep asking those questions of it and replay it. Go rewind, go forward, and see what the heck is going on in the piece. So I don't know. So how have you cultivated, that film study of a piece of writing so you get to be a better writer as a result of that deep study?
Ooh, I love this analogy because I've never actually done a sport where I had to study like another team's film, but I love this analogy because I can relate to it in the writing life, in that I, will look at a piece that I love and then I'll try to dissect it and figure out, why it's working. What are the pieces of it? What's the anatomy of the piece? What's the architecture? What techniques are they using? How are they shifting verb tenses in order to have a certain effect? What is the point of view? What deliberate decisions are kind of going into this piece that are making it work? So I like to dissect a piece almost like it's a frog. And I am trying to learn how to teach this in my classes as I learn, as I teach creative writing. I'm trying to learn how to give this skill to other students who might not approach it that way, because I think it's one of the most valuable things that you can have in your arsenal to keep growing as a writer through the years. Because, sometimes you don't have that great editor or that great instructor available to you all of the time, but you can always turn to a text and keep learning from it.
In your experience with your students, what has been maybe their biggest hang up or something that they really struggle with as you start to, give them, I don't know, what is it, the red pill in the matrix to turn them from just just readers into writer readers?
It's funny because I think you just can never take for granted anything. You can't assume that anyone knows anything. So I've always been worried that by trying to simplify things to too basic a level, that I was going to be patronizing or condescending. But I've learned that no, actually, starting with the fundamentals, like in a sport, is a great idea. So one of the most challenging things has been at the beginning of a semester, particularly when I've been teaching a class in a creative writing department instead of a journalism department. It's, getting the students on board with the idea that, interviewing isn't necessary journalism. It's a tool. Interviewing is like a knife. You can use a knife to be a surgeon. You could be a chef. You could be a axe murderer. A knife is a tool. Interviewing is a tool. It's not necessarily journalism. It's part of the writing process. And then the other thing is just breaking it down to scene, summary, and exposition. And that I was really, really shocked that a lot of people don't know even what a scene is. And if given a story, they struggle to identify a scene and differentiate it from summary and a section where you might be explaining something. And so I actually, early in the semester, I have them take a story and 3 highlighters, and I have them highlight scene and summary and exposition, and then step back and look at those patterns of the colors to see the structure. Being able to take a highlighter and look through different lenses at your own text is such a valuable tool. Like another thing that I do with them is to highlight things that are high on the ladder of abstraction and low on the ladder of abstraction, and to make sure that they're mostly low, because I think that's the, that when you're low, you're concrete, and that's when you create the movie that plays out in your reader's mind. And if you can sprinkle in highs now and then, you can elevate that. But I think it's really fun to try to stay, almost completely low on the ladder of abstraction for, an entire section to see how long you can do it.
Now in reading your work and reading analysis of your work and how you talk about your work, you are clearly you're a structure nerd. And
totally.
So how did that muscle start to refine itself, and how did you get into, structure as such a key part of what you bring to the craft?
Gosh, I don't know. The first thing that comes to mind is John McPhee.
Yeah.
Reading him talk about structure gets me really excited. And I don't know. I just think that from a macro sense, or from a zoom out sense, you can kind of just see the bones of a piece, and then it makes the writing easier. Like if I go into a piece and I have an idea of the structure of it, it makes the actual laying down of sentence after sentence so much easier because I know where I'm going. And I've likened it to the process of building a house. You could just start building a wall. You could build a house wall by wall, and you could build the wall and then, put the drywall up and then, start painting it. But that would be just silly, right? The actual process of building a house is more like, okay, you have kind of a blueprint, that's your plan. But then as you start framing the walls, you do a walkthrough and you're like, you know what, this wall is kind of wonky, or this is in the wrong place, or we need to move this window or something. And, it's a better time to move that wall when you haven't put the drywall up. And then once you're, once you're sure that all of the rooms are where they should be. And I do think like a story, like a house, if you walked into a stranger's house, you should be able to find the kitchen. You should be able to find the bathroom. It shouldn't be like in some weird place, right? And so the same thing with the story is, a reader should kind of find their way through a story and never feel lost. And so if there's one point where they suddenly feel really disoriented and confused, then, the wall's in the wrong place. So it's easier to move those things around early, and it's easier to move them, I think, if you know they exist in the first place, and if you go in kind of with that blueprint. So then when it comes time to do all of the, the subsequent steps, it's, I don't know, the big pieces are where they should be. And then you kind of get more granular and more refined, and it's actually fun.
Yeah. I like that idea of, there's an intuitive sense when you go into a house, where certain things are. It's not, but if you were overly explicit about the structure of the house, you'd be handing people a pamphlet of the blueprint. And that's like the exact opposite of what you want to do in a piece of writing. You want it to just kind of feel implicit to the piece, almost unnoticed. But if you burrow a little deeper, you're like, oh, I can start to see the scaffolding here that was subsequently, stripped away by the writer, so I could enjoy this as a reader.
Exactly. I think, you don't need a sign that's like the bathroom's over here. You don't need a neon flashing light that's like kitchen, kitchen, kitchen. It just should, you should feel comfortable in it. Like, you can find your way. And I think structure, when it's done really well, it's invisible and seamless to the reader. And I've done some little experiments with structure where it was just for me. It was either, for the purpose of the story, but I've if I do any kind of, crazy things, my rule is that, it can't get in the way of the reader. It can't get in the way of the story. And if it comes at the cost of the reader, then I have to throw it out.
Yeah. And you did that as the palindromic structure of the piece of Leon and Noel for Bicycle Magazine. And was that one of those deals where you're like, I'm going to do some structural pyrotechnics that are sort of, they're noticeable upon subsequent reads, but ultimately, I'm sort of the only one who notices off the bat.
Exactly. That was kind of my goal for that piece. And that, I wouldn't normally recommend a wonky structure, except that particular material begged for it. It was probably the only story in the history of the universe where it made sense to try to structure as a palindrome, just because of the nature of the story. But I actually, I when I learn about the story, so I'll for readers who aren't familiar with the piece, I'll explain it. When I found out about the story, I thought this couldn't possibly be true because it was so weird and wonderful. And basically, two strangers, an American and a Brit, independent of one another, decided to ride their bicycles solo across Eurasia. One rode east to west, the other rode west to east. And by total chance, smack dab in the middle, like at almost the exact midpoint, they meet in the middle of an empty desert, and one of them desperately needs help, and the other one just happens to be able to help him. And they sort of, realize that they're doing the same journey in reverse. Their personalities are very much opposite. They're almost like matter and antimatter. And when they meet, they realize that their names are the same name in opposite directions. So one is Noel, Noel, and the other is Leon, Leon. And they just kind of chuckle and are like, well, isn't that funny? And they go on their way. And only in recounting the story later to people do they realize that it really is kind of something. So because their names were a palindrome and their journeys were, parallel journeys in opposite directions, I just thought, I want to try to write this as a palindrome. And so I structured it so that the opening scene and the ending scene are both the meeting in the middle of the story. And then the sections alternate from, in point of view, it's a braided narrative. So it's Leon, Noel, Leon, Noel, Leon, Noel, Leon, and then it ends with a meeting. So there's this point in the story where you have to actually skip the meeting, because in chronology, that's where the meeting should occur. But it was a big struggle because I tried to figure out how to do that, to flash forward and then come back to the meeting. And that was the big riddle of the piece that I had to solve. And I was so worried about it being kind of my little precious conceit that I submitted 2 versions of the story to my editor. So Matt Allen was the first editor on the piece. And I was like, Matt, here's the palindrome version. Here's the normal chronology. You tell me if it's working or not, because if it's not, I have to throw it away. To his credit, he came back and said, I want you to do the palindrome, but I need to give you more words because you need more words to establish the pattern. And then Leah Flickinger was the second editor on the piece, and she totally got it and was in support of it. So, but again, my rule was that it should be invisible to anyone except for me and my editors and my writer friends with whom I can geek out about it now.
That's amazing. And something that you recently said just made me maybe want to ask this too. You said like the material begged for that kind of structure. And I wonder for you, like when you're approaching a piece, at what point does the structure start to reveal itself to you over the course of your reporting?
That's a good question. I feel like it's kind of different for every piece. I really am a lot happier when I know the beginning and the end when I go into a piece. And that's pretty common. Like I'm just writing a good dog essay right now for Garden and Gun about my dog. And I know, that the beginning is the origin story, like how she came into our life. And then I know how it's going to end. And then the middle, I mean, it just kind of like, well, a normal chronology really serves this the best. But in other pieces, I really love like in Medias Res, because I like to start in the middle of the action at the like moment of truth when, and then end the first section or chapter with kind of a cliffhanger, because it generates so much narrative momentum and tension that it just slingshots the reader through the story. And they have to keep reading because they know what's at stake right away. And then you can afford to kind of rewind and go through moments that give context to the big kind of, crux of the story. And then they kind of know where they're heading. So it's a very self-orienting and fun structure. But, every story kind of, reveals itself to you in different ways. And I guess as I'm going through, like that, there's this one I'm thinking about, and I was talking about it with Leah, my editor, and going, well, I could, there's several moments of tension, and I could do like the big moment of tension or the surprise moment of tension before that, when, we knew what the moment of truth is going to be, but actually there's a surprise thing that goes wrong before that. And that's even kind of more, it creates even more tension because you're like, oh, I wasn't expecting that. So I don't know. And sometimes I think you don't know if it works until you get it down on paper. And that's what's fun. And that's what's fun about revision is that, we're not going out there and doing like a live show in front of anyone where we're like, well, that was the wrong way to do it. You can do it and totally mess it up and then be like, nope, got to do it another way. And that's okay. And it's part of that. And you learn from those times, I think, when you do it the wrong way, because you learn, oh, okay, well, this doesn't work because of this reason. And so whatever reason it is that it doesn't work is the consideration that you have the next time you enter a piece and try to wrestle it.
Yeah, I know.
Does that make sense?
I know McPhee, sometimes he had, in draft number 4, he talks about there are certain structures that he kind of reports to. Like he's like, I'd like to tackle this kind of double profile or 3-person profile over, a B, C, and D thread over A or whatever. You know what I'm talking about because I'm sure you've seen the essays. But it's one of those things where it's like, all right, he had a preconceived, almost like a prefab house, and he's like, all right, I just got to go find the parts to that house and then build that house. Whereas I think some other people that could limit you in a bad way, or some, maybe you can be reporting wrong. You're not reporting for the right structure. So it's such a weird tightrope to really balance.
I agree. That's sort of the experts only, don't try this at home. Like that's the Evel Knievel way to go about, I think, storytelling, is that you have to be John McPhee or someone like him to pull that off. It's not what I would recommend to any writer short of John McPhee and his level, just because it could go wrong in a lot of ways where you're kind of, going out like with the structure in mind and then having to find the story to fit it. And I mean, that is one way of doing it, and he makes it work, and he makes it work beautifully. But I just think that for most writers, it would be kind of a recipe for trouble.
Yeah, I wonder in the collection of raw material, and this is always the challenge for people doing nonfiction. It's not just reporting and gathering information, but it's reporting for story. So how do you go about reporting for story, or reporting for narrative?
So I think that especially interviewing, it's very different. But before I even get to interviewing, let me start here. So, it's funny. I was vetting the story. An editor came to me and said, "Hey, I want you to do a story about this thing that happened in Afghanistan and with people who are all over the world. And can you make it happen?" And I was going, "Oh my gosh, it sounds like such a complicated nightmare. No, I don't have time for this, but I'll do it just because I'll wonder." Well, I went to someone and, immediately began ticking off, like, here's what I need to do a narrative. And I was like, okay, so I need a central character. I know there's a lot of people involved in this thing, and, but I need a central character. I need to, I need her to, speak English, or I need to have a translator. I need to be able, she needs to live in a place where I can actually, Skype with her or Zoom or get her on the phone. Because as I found with Leon, you can't really do that with China. I need written, recorded dialogue is one of the most important things I go looking for, because dialogue is really key, and it's the hardest thing to get right. And if it's recorded or transcribed in some way, then that it's pretty, that it's legit. Whereas if it's recollected, it's less likely to be, actual dialogue. It'll be, perhaps pretty close, but people's memories are fallible. Yeah. So, one of the things that I learned from What Stands in a Storm was the importance of time-stamped material, time-stamped dialogue. So for that book, I was basically recreating the biggest superstorm to hit anywhere, big tornado outbreak, 3 days, 349 tornadoes over 21 states. And it was so complicated, but I started with a timeline. So one of my characters was James Spann, a meteorologist who, when there's a tornado outbreak, he goes on the air and does wall-to-wall coverage. So no commercials, no interruptions. And so his footage of that day, his coverage was uploaded on YouTube, and I transcribed all of it, and I timestamped every time he said something. I timestamped it, and then I had little screenshots of moments when, for example, he was standing in front of a screen where he has an inset of a tornado happening in one town, and he has audio of a different tornado happening in a different town, and he's trying to warn people in both places at the same time. And so I had little screenshots, and then if he said, "Oh my God, look at this, the radar is really a mess," then I was able to go and get a radar screenshot of that time. So I have this timeline with timestamps, and then over that I overlaid sources of dialogue and scenes that were timestamped. So one of the biggest challenges of reporting on a natural disaster or any kind of big traumatic thing is that people's memory gets pretty fogged by the trauma. So they're likely to remember the emotions accurately, but the accuracy of their facts gets pretty compromised by the trauma. And so I found radio transmissions between first responders that I didn't realize until I had them are timestamped. And so when I interviewed one responder, he couldn't remember when he got to this particular house. He said, it could have been 11 o'clock p.m. It could have been 3 a.m. I have no idea. But I had a radio transmission that said 10:22 p.m. or whatever. And then hey, we've got 7 guys going to the house. And then I knew from that we had 7 people coming to the scene at this particular time. And that, you could assume they were there sometime after that. And then I had text messages that were conversations between a sister who survived and a sister who didn't. And because they were timestamped, I was able to, layer those over I knew, for example, that one of the characters was watching James Spann on TV. And when she said, "Oh my God, look at that thing," I knew exactly what she was looking at on the TV. And I knew exactly what James Spann was looking at on his radar screen. So it's kind of this layering of primary sources. And nowadays with social media, we have kind of an embarrassment of riches, almost too much, so that you have to be meticulous about being able to sort through all the tedious stuff to get a few nuggets. You have to mine for a long time to get like one good piece of information. But when you do, it's really worth it. And then the other thing that I really use in reporting for Scene is I use Google Earth a lot. It's an amazing tool. I have no idea how it's free. But I use that for Noel and Leon, and also for the tornadoes. So for the tornado story, the National Weather Service has pages where they have, I guess, KML and KMZ files that are somehow GPS coordinates that you can download and put in your Google Earth kind of system. And I could see the width of the tornado. I could see the track. I could see how long it was. I could click on this information and see pictures taken from the survey that they do to determine what category of tornado it is. I had the number of people injured, the number of people who were killed in each tornado. I mean, it was really, really pretty amazing. And then to be able to go into Google Earth and zoom in on a house. You can also use the history tool to scroll back in time, and you can go to the day before the tornado and the day after the tornado, and you can see all the trees that were there before, and then you can see that everything's flattened afterwards. You can see in some cases, particular houses that were crushed. And oh my gosh, it's just mind-blowing to me that we can do that we have these satellites flying overhead that can capture this in such detail that I was able to go with the Noel and Leon story. I was able to zoom in on the tea house in the middle of the Kazakhstan desert where they met. And Noel had a GPS a GPS unit that didn't tell him where to go, but it left breadcrumbs. So I knew exactly how many miles he rode each day, exactly how much elevation, and I could actually see his path. And you can see his path like veer off the dirt road to go to the tea house and then to veer back onto the road. I mean, it's amazing. So I would say, getting those primary sources down before you even start the interview process is really helpful, because then you can use those things to enhance or help the memory of your sources who might not remember or it might not occur to them to share with you things. You'll ask questions you'll ask questions differently going in armed with all of those details and that knowledge. Then you can start saying, okay, put me in the house. I couldn't find, for example, a picture of the house where 3 students died in one of the tornadoes that hit Tuscaloosa. So going back to the book, sorry, I'm jumping around a lot. But
no, that's fine.
I was not able to find a picture of the inside of the house. So then I had to kind of put on a fiction writer's hat, which I had never done and was kind of scary. And I was like, okay, if I was writing a scene, what would I need to see in this scene? And I was like, okay, I would visualize myself walking into the house, and that's what would guide my interview. Okay, walk me through this house. What when you open the door, what's the first thing you see? Can you draw me a map of the floor plan? Where was the place they were hiding under the stairs? Okay, how were they seeing the TV? What could they see from that spot? And if you turn your head to the right, what do you see? If you turn your head to the left, what do you see? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? And so you have to kind of imagine what you would need to put in the scene if you were just making it up. And then it's almost like you have to assume and then fact check your assumptions with the people who were there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It puts you in the right headspace. Well, it's kind of like one of your students who when they almost didn't know what a scene was. It's like, well, visualize it and paint the picture. And then in your case here, you're painting that picture and be like, okay, now, verify for me what these things are. This is what I want to see. Now help me actually see it in a verifiably true way.
Right. And then, pictures And, anything that you have that you can show to the source, they might be like, oh, I forgot about that painting. Let me tell you about that painting, or you can ask them about things that it wouldn't even occur to them to tell you. But you have to kind of prep them for that. Like I'm going to be asking really, really, specific things. So bear with me. This is what it's for. But it's really fun. I think it's one of my favorite parts of this work that we do.
Yeah. Is that where you would say you probably feel most alive and engaged in the whole process?
Yeah. I just love the whole dang thing. Even I just love all of it. Even the tedious bullshit. Like I have right now downstairs, I have 12,000 pages of court transcripts to go through. And I've found a way to I have some volunteers who are willing to read, but I'm like, I kind of want to read every page because I don't want to miss everything. And I love all of it. But yeah, and there are moments when I love the writing more than others. It's the hardest part for sure. But I even love that part. I know it's almost kind of like taboo to say that, but I even love it when it's hard. So yeah. It's all just, this is all I could ever imagine doing.
That's amazing. Well, tell me a little bit about your 10-year vision plan.
You read about the 10-year vision plan. Well, I want to be, I want to be writing books and long form narratives. My sweet spot is, meticulously reported narratives that I want to read more and more like fiction, but be fact checkable by a National Geographic trained fact checker. And I just, the piece that is missing right now is just kind of the business model for making it stable. Like I've been really lucky to be completely freelance, completely making a living, making words for 7 years now. I don't know. Let's see. 2003 is, I think, when I quit my job. There have been years when it felt fine, but then I had a couple really major setbacks that were really unexpected that have made it, a lot scarier and harder to come back from. And so, I think in the next 10 years, I just want to be in a place where I have overlapping book contracts. And so that I think that's really the key is that, a book contract, the quote advance, as I learned with my first book, doesn't get paid all in advance. It might be paid out in quarters over 4 years or over 3 years. And so I think if I can do a book every 2 to 3 years and they have overlapping, advance payments like that, and then, pepper in some 4,000 to 6,000 word freelance narratives and maybe some little things to just, have a sense of finishing stuff. I like that's what I want. And to keep teaching, teach just enough that it's invigorating. Like you spend so much time in your head as a writer that I love teaching because it makes me come out of my head and engage with people, and helping other people is just really fun and exciting. And it refuels the tank that I then, draw from when I'm writing. So I guess that's what it would look like. And I would really, really love to have my own writing retreat. Right now I, rely on the kindness of others because as a working mom with a 13-year-old kid and a husband who also works from the house, and when he's not, taking conference calls, he's operating power tools. It's really hard to write at home. And so my best tool for getting, the kind of writing done that needs to be done for long form is to go to a borrowed cabin or a house somewhere and hole up for 10 to 14 days and eat, sleep, and write and ride my bike and just kind of be, immerse myself in the process without interruption. So I guess my big dream would be, to have my own place. However, it could be a cabin off the grid where I have like a wood burning fireplace. That'd be fine. But it just, I feel almost like I'm having to mooch off of friends who have, second homes or places that they kindly let me go to do my work.
Nice. And you also wrote in the same newsletter that, chasing hard news isn't really your jam. Totally agree. I'm not a breaking news person. I'm a narrative guy through and through. You also say you're drawn to timeless stories that lack a news hook. That's hard to pitch. Also, I don't enjoy pitching. So,
Oh,
so
yes.
how do you navigate that, given that the crux of doing these kind of things does rely on the almighty pitch?
Yeah. Well, one, I over the report the heck out of everything, like to a fault, probably. I'll do months of reporting, sometimes at great expense, before I even pitch a story, because I want to know I have the access and I want to know what the story is. But sometimes you do so much that you have a hard time distilling it into, the right angle or the right thread for a particular publication. And I always know when I don't have it, because my litmus test is the one breath pitch. Like, I need to be able to say what the story's about in one breath. And if I have to breathe several times, it's too much. To be honest, I think I have a bad habit of just staying in my safe zone. And I have a few editors that I love working with, who know me really well, who get me, and they either send me stories that they know are my kind of stories, or I chicken out on pitching bigger publications, because I know that I know this editor's going to get it. I know she gets me, and I don't have to sell as hard. It's really hard, I think, when you go to a new publication, a new editor you haven't worked with, and you have to, first you have to sell yourself. And that's really hard, I think, for most writers, to be like, here's why I'm the best one to do this. Yeah. It's really hard. And then to presume to know what it is that they're looking for in a story if you haven't had a conversation. So I think maybe one of the best tools that I can recommend for doing it better than I do is to try to have like a meet and greet, a low pressure conversation with an editor, where you get to know what like they're looking for, what makes them tick, what makes a good story for their publication. And then you can look at your story and this massive reporting through the lens of that editor's, needs. And I think that makes it a little bit easier, but I don't know. I think pitching is one of the hardest things to do.
What's your one breath pitch for your new book about the Stahl house?
It is a biography of a house, would be kind of the simple explanation, but really it's a story of a blue collar family with a white collar dream. And and the main character in the book is a house.
Right. And what becomes the challenge of telling the story of a house when you could have made this an architectural biography, which part of it is, but ultimately it's about the people who inhabit it. So how did you navigate, that in the telling the biography of this house?
Well, I kind of looked at the arc of the house, and it sort of begins as a dream. So the book is called The Stahl House, Case Study House 22, The Making of a Modernist Icon. And it's about one of the most famous houses really in the world. This house has been photographed more than Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. And it's been in at least a dozen movies and TV shows. It's been in every fashion magazine imaginable. And it's even been on The Simpsons. It's like this pop culture thing. But, it really began in 1954 as a crazy dream of these newlyweds, Buck and Carlotta Stahl, who were living in a little apartment in the Hollywood Hills. And when they looked out of their window, they could see a ridge in the foreground. And they just could see a little point on this ridge that looked like an island in the sky. And they just started joking that this was our lot. Like, we're going to live there one day. And it was, kind of just a pipe dream. And at that time, there were very few houses built in the Hollywood Hills. So it was just one of many lots graded for development. And one day they just went up there on a whim and said, let's go see our lot. And by coincidence, the owner of the lot happened to pull in. He lived in another town and just happened to be there for the day. And the lot was for sale. They bought it for $100 in a handshake. And then they dreamed up the house that they could put there that wouldn't obscure any of the view. They had in this lot a 270-degree view of Los Angeles and the ocean beyond it. And they didn't want any walls. And so they actually, Buck, who was a commercial artist and then later went into sales in the aerospace industry, he built a model of the lot he used crushed beer cans and clay and built a replica of the lot. And then he built a model of the house that he thought would give him a view from every room. And then he started shopping with this model for architects, and everyone turned him down and said, that's not buildable, or the lot's too small, or the lot's unbuildable because it was on a cliff. And so basically the whole first, act of the house is that it's this impossible idea. It's impossible to build. And when he finds the right architect in Pierre Koenig, a young architect who knew how to build with steel, which was the only way to have all glass walls, it starts to become possible, but then they have one hurdle after another to actually get it built and passed, approved by City Hall, which the City Hall had never seen anything like it. And it was just, it was breaking rules that hadn't even been written. So, again, the Act One is kind of about this impossible thing. Well, then it gets built, and then it kind of turns into this architectural marvel. And also it was, home. And that's the chapter that I think not a lot of people who think they know everything about this house know, is that, it was the house of this family that was neither rich nor famous. They somehow raised 3 kids in this 2-bedroom, 2,300 square foot house that also had a pool immediately outside the children's bedroom. So the children had to get on and get up and put life vests over their pajamas to come out. So then it was just kind of a home. And then at some point, a museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles, does this major exhibition on the Case Study House program, which I didn't even go into, but it's what this house came out of in the post-World War II era. And so that kind of gets the house on the radar of Hollywood. And then it enters this era of fame where it starts appearing in movies and magazines. And then the house starts making money for the family that worked so hard to build it and make it possible. So it's almost like the arc of the house has these different phases, and I don't know, the people who made it and the people who lived there were kind of the supporting characters. But it all kind of revolves around this house. So I don't know if that makes sense. I did read Tracy Kidder's House for inspiration, but that turns out to be a very different kind of book about the making of a house. But
right. So what did it mean to be a case study house?
So the Case Study House program, and granted, I knew nothing about this when I started this book. Case Study House program was one of the greatest experiments in American architecture. So as World War II was drawing to a close, there was an editor named John Intenza who ran a magazine called Arts and Architecture. And he was not an architect, but he was a smart guy. And he had this realization that we would be sending home at the end of the war 6 to 7 million American GIs, and they would have no place to live because all of the home building materials and resources and labor had been diverted to the war effort all of these years, and virtually no houses had been built. So all of a sudden, all these people were going to come home. We were going to have a housing crisis. And in the housing crisis, he envisioned that a lot of bad designed houses were going to be built. And he didn't want that to happen because he was, he was a modernist. And so he came up with the idea that we could tap the nation's best young modernist architects to reimagine the American lifestyle and redesign the American home and just the middle-class American home. He thought that he could give them, match an architect with a client, and the architect could design for the client a house that would serve as a prototype that could then be replicated nationwide using the processes of mass production and the materials developed for the war, which then needed a domestic market. So it was really, really a cool idea. And he, commissioned a whole bunch of houses, and it was this win-win-win situation where, the architect got to experiment with new materials, which were donated or sold at cost by suppliers in exchange for getting featured in the magazine. So they got free advertising. And then the clients got a little bit of a break on price because those supplies were donated or sold at cost. And so the magazine would publish the drawings that the architects produced before the house was built. It would publish then, in a later issue, photographs of the house going up, the construction. And then when it was done, it would photograph the results, and it would keep the house open to the public for tours for some weeks before the family could move in. And it really was a great idea that, now when I look at modern shelter magazines and they have idea houses, it really kind of I guess, started here, the program didn't actually achieve the goals of producing these, mass-produced, good designed houses because the lending community was conservative. Like banks basically didn't want to give mortgages on modern houses. They wanted traditional houses that they knew would sell. And then also the construction industry was used to doing things the way they did, which is, getting materials on site, cutting wood, and they were not set up to suddenly start building with steel, which requires a whole different set of tools and skill sets and procedures and processes. And so the experiment kind of failed, but now these houses are kind of architectural gems. And looking back, like John Intenza was really ahead of his time. It was a brilliant idea that didn't work out. And yet we learned a lot about design from it.
Yeah, you also write that the Stahl house is a portal. So in what way was it, or is it a portal?
You step in this house and it takes you back to an era when the world was different. It's really amazing. The house hasn't changed very well. It's changed very little. They added a jacuzzi, but they've taken, most of the houses as it was built. And when you go there, you feel, the optimism and the freedom of that post-war era when you felt like, anything was possible, and it was a very hopeful era. And the modernists believed that they could change the world by changing the way people lived. And you just kind of feel that in this house. And I'm no architecture expert, but the fact that something that's inanimate, this designed place, could move you emotionally and take you back to this time and place is pretty remarkable. So if you ever get a chance to go take a tour, you should. It's really something.
Now, in this book too, there isn't a whole lot of what I would say like classic sort of tension or conflict in the book. There is a kernel of it, but I think it was more or less saved for the end notes, which we'll get into in a moment. But for a book of this nature, where there isn't that like what happens next, like how did you keep how do you keep shoveling coal into that furnace when there wasn't that classic narrative propulsion that something we're used to with a real page turner, if that makes any sense?
Well, I do think it's there on a chapter level. Like in each chapter, there is a little thread of tension. In the beginning, it's the dream, but we could never afford it. And then how do they make it possible? Later it's how are we going to get it approved? The architect was just battling with City Hall, and they were having problems getting it approved, and they had to redesign some things in order to actually make it happen. And then later, when it was getting ready to be photographed, there's a lot of tension because on the day it was supposed to be photographed, like it wasn't done. The floors were bare concrete. There was plaster dust everywhere. The landscaping wasn't done. And the photographer's like going, I need to get in here and shoot because the deadline's next week. And the architect is stressing out because the house isn't done. So there is tension, but it's more on the arc of the house maybe doesn't have the tension of a typical novel, but each chapter has its own little thing of tension. And then there's a chapter on all of the threats to the house, like the fire that came within a quarter of a mile from destroying the house. So I do think it's there. It's just on a chapter by chapter level, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. And there's also the tension between the very sort of bullheaded photographer, but also with the architect. And then there's also this idea that Buck had this model of the house, but Koenig was just like, no, he didn't. I didn't see that. This house is my idea. So it was almost like a conflict of egos in a lot of ways too.
Exactly. And I think that's where the real tension for me came in, because I wanted everyone's side of the story to be heard and didn't want to, and there's some things that we we will never know for sure. Like I looked really hard for, because these people are not around to speak for themselves. So I had to go off of interview transcripts that they did when they were alive. And so, I searched for an interview transcript where Koenig said, I saw Buck's model, and I couldn't find that. But I did hear him talking about the elements of Buck's model that he then had to change. And so I had to be very careful handling that in a way that didn't, offend the people and the historians who are like, well, we don't, there's a lot of people who will believe that, Pierre didn't see the model. And there are a lot of people who are going to believe that, of course he did. And so I tried to kind of leave that up to the reader to decide what they believe and give them, the facts that I was able to find. So that's where, that's where a lot of tension for me came from.
Yeah. And you do something cool with the end notes, where you make into, a narrative end notes. So what was the purpose behind that instead of just annotating things in the back?
Well, I knew you had read those, and I'm so delighted that you read my end notes. One thing was that there were so many little stories, little side stories that either didn't pass fact checking, but were really fun, like things to consider. And there were things that just didn't fit in the chapter, but they were part of the mystique and the story of the house. And I just thought, like, I didn't want to write, however many pages of endnotes there are. I didn't want to write like stuff that was just going to be tacked on like a dead weight, like an albatross. And I also I just didn't want to write endnotes. I think I looked at all of the different formats and studied different books, and I was like, I'm going to claw my eyes out if I have to do this, and no one's going to read them. I wanted them to be useful for a future researcher or an architecture student, but I also wanted them to be like part of the book that you'd actually want to read. So some of my favorite little tidbits are actually in the endnotes. And I have to say, like, one of my favorite parts of the book got cut because, out of respect for Carlotta, it was just a little bit risque, but it was one of my favorite parts, and I'll share it with you because it's funny. But basically, there's a moment where I realized that this house has inspired art, but also it might have, I don't know. There's this full circle moment of possibly art inspiring architecture and then inspiring art, and so I think it started when I found this Miu Miu shoot. Miu Miu is I guess part of Prada, the designer. There was a photograph of models falling into the pool. And then there was a photograph of like someone diving into the pool and the splash is coming up out of the pool. All you see is the splash. And then the Stahl house in the background is blacked out. And I was like, why would you black out the Stahl house? That's weird. And so I went and interviewed the photographer, and he said, oh, well, it was inspired by a painting by David Hockney. And the painting's called A Bigger Splash, and it's very famous. And David Hockney is a British artist who is now in his 70s or 80s, maybe. I don't know. But he's still painting. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. I think it was kind of a 1960s era painting. And then I found a quote attributed to David Hockney, and in it he said, I moved to Los Angeles from England for two reasons. And one of them was Julius Schulman's photograph of Case Study House 21. And then in the stories where this quote was used, they went on to talk about the importance of swimming pools on his work. Well, I got to thinking, wait a minute, Case Study House 21 doesn't have a swimming pool. 21 was also designed by Pierre Koenig and also photographed by Julius Schulman, and is very close to 22, but 22 has a pool and 21 does not. So what if he really meant 22? Then it would be this really crazy circle of like, Julius Schulman's photograph of this house inspired Hockney to come here. He paints this painting, which then inspires a photo shoot that takes place at the Stahl house. Like, wouldn't that be really neat? Yeah. And I mean, of course, this matters to no one but me. But I went to great lengths to fact check this, and I couldn't figure out like where the source of the quote came from. It was attributed to a woman named Diane Hansen, and it was used in two different kind of art magazine articles about David Hockney. So I'm looking through, is she an art historian? Is she an architect? Is she, who is this woman? Well, I come to find out that Diane Hansen is the sexy book editor for Taschen, which is a publisher who does a lot of beautiful books about modernist architecture and also newts. They do a lot of, like the sexy book line does like the big book of breasts and the big book of butts. And, you get the idea, right? And so I was like, well, maybe she has a transcript. So I emailed Diane Hansen, and she gets right back to me, and she's really lovely. And she's like, no, that actually, there was no interview. It was a comment he made at a dinner party in which he was talking about why he came to LA. And he said the other reason, and she's like, and this is the more germane to the conversation, you can't leave this part out, is that, reason number one might have been for him coming to the United States might have been, Julia Schulman's photograph of one of the case study houses. But the other reason was this homoerotic nude photo magazine called Physique Pictorial. And I'm like, wow, this is really a big non sequitur for this book. So I was like, okay, well, do you think he meant 22? She's like, he very well might have. Like, we were all drinking, and 21, 22, same photographer, same architect, like that would make sense. And so I tried to go through David Hockney's People, and I couldn't. They basically just, shut me down, because he's painting in France, and he's painting in Normandy, and he doesn't want to be, interrupted. So at some point I know that he doesn't like emails. So I got on a 1930s Royal typewriter and typed him out like a note, and put it in a handwritten envelope and sent him $20, and was just like, basically like, did you really mean 22? Here's the picture, here's the quote, like, checkbox, here's a postcard, send it back. I don't think it got to him, but it was really, really fun, like trying to nail it down. And at some point, I think Kelly Lynch, who's the actress, she's big into mid-century modern preservation of architecture. And I got on the phone with her, and she told me this wonderful story about a cocktail, a party for Julius Schulman. It was like his 90-something birthday party, and she threw it. And there was a champagne glass with a burlesque dancer, dancing in bubbles in the champagne glass. And at some point she throws her bra off, and it lands on Julius's head. And at the end of the night, Julius Schulman says that was the best night of my life. So I found the burlesque dancer. Her name is Catherine Delish, and I fact checked it with her. But ultimately, all of this got cut because Carlotta Stahl was very adamant that, as much photography went on in her house and filming, there was going to be no nudity and no no sex movies there. And so, her kids were like, I don't think we can put this in. Like, our mom would be really upset. So we had to cut it out. But anyway, it was kind of fun rabbit trail. So that's the kind of stuff that you'll find in the footnotes. And that's why I made them into, or the endnotes. That's why I made them into narrative endnotes, is so that you would actually want to read them. And if you did, you would kind of walk away like chuckling and glad you did. So did you enjoy them? I hope.
Oh, yeah. Oh, of course. Yeah. I had come to it late in the night when I had finished the book proper at night, and there was only, there was like 5 or so pages of those narrative endnotes. I'm like, I'm going to save these for the next day, because I want to come at these fresh. And it was great. It delivered for sure.
And I'd never seen it done, and was like, oh, why not?
Absolutely.
So, but really, I couldn't decide on a real format, and I think it would have just killed my soul.
Oh my God.
To do it the normal way.
Right. Oh yeah, for sure. Now, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the photograph, the famous photograph that's on the cover of the book that Julia Schulman took, One Shot Schulman, and how famous and iconic that photograph is, because that's very much enmeshed in the narrative of the house.
It is. It is such an amazing photograph. So it was one of Time Magazine's 100 most iconic photographs of all time. There was a bookazine that came out, and you recognize a lot of the pictures, like the picture of the guys having lunch on the skyscraper, is on the cover. But it was this photograph that is probably the most published and famous photographs of anything Julia Schulman took. It isn't probably, it is. It is his most famous photograph. And but even outside of Schulman's context, it really sums up a moment in time and the whole optimism of the post-World War II era. It just signifies everything that California, and particularly Hollywood, was at that time. And when you look at it, you're like, that's the dream. That's the California dream, is living in a place like this. And it's a nighttime photograph of the corner of a house, and the house is cantilevered over a cliff, and it's in the Hollywood Hills. So the city of Los Angeles just spreads out like this glittering carpet from there to the horizon. And what's really cool is in this nighttime photograph, because the streets are lit up at night, you can see how the angles of the house, the lines of the roof, the lines of the floor actually extend and match perfectly up with the lines of the gridded streets below. And that was not by accident. So Pierre Koenig really wanted the house to be an extension of the city, and the city to be an extension of the house. So they are really kind of, enmeshed together, and you really see it in this photograph. And then in the suspended corner of the house, which is brightly lit and in sharp contrast to the dark outside, you see these two young women in white dresses sitting with their ankles crossed, and back straight, just, talking to one another. And what's so interesting about this photo is that it contains no one who actually had anything to do with the house. The girls were girlfriends of two architecture students that Pierre Koenig recruited to come help with the photo shoot, because Julius Schulman liked to put people in his photographs. So he was, he's largely considered to be someone who changed like the course of lifestyle photography by putting people and greenery in his photos. And so he told Pierre, like, hey, tell your architecture students to bring their girlfriends, tell them to wear something nice, they might be in a photo. And so they were actually just sitting there in the corner of the living room when Schulman was setting up an indoor shot, and he stepped outside for some reason. And when he stepped outside, he saw them there and thought that, oh, we're completely resetting up the shot. And so he changed the lights. He had the girls, sit there in the dark. And there's this famous, I think it was something like a 7-minute exposure where it was very tricky, because back then, no digital photography, of course. And he had them, I think, sit in the dark for 7 minutes, perfectly still, while he turned off all the lights and he opened the shutter and let the ambient light from the city kind of burn itself into the negative. And then he had replaced the lights in basically in all of the lights that you see in the picture, in the interior lights, with flash bulbs. And when the flash bulbs went off for just a split second, it lit the shot and the interior. And so it's a really tricky exposure. And to think that he just nailed it with one shot at a time when you couldn't like chimp and look at your pictures is pretty amazing. So that story is in the book. And I actually have, a sidebar where he tells it in his own words. And it's pretty cool to see like how it was created and all of the things that had to come together. But what I think is most important about this shot is that without this photograph, I don't think the house would be as famous as it is today. I don't know that the case study house program would be quite as renowned as it is, because the photograph really showed, it doesn't even show the whole house, but it really captured the essence of what this was all about, and the essence of the time in which it took place. So it's, I don't know, I think Time Magazine had a good reason to put it in that book.
What did it mean for you to be able to jump off the roof of the house and into that pool?
So it's funny because, one of the little known stories, I think, behind the house is that Bruce and Sherry, who are my co-authors, who grew up in the house, their dad was Buck Stahl and their mom was Carlotta. When they were little kids, like 6 or 7, their dad propped a ladder up against the roof and climbed up there with them, and they all jumped off the roof into the pool. And the roof has these long overhanging eaves, and so you just had to kind of aim for the deep end, and it's a pretty deep pool. And then Bruce actually they both went on to be competitive swimmers in high school, and Bruce went on to break a world record in the 50-meter free. And so this pool really shaped their lives. So when they came to me and basically asked me to write their book, and they said, but if you really want to know what it was like to grow up in this house, you have to jump off the roof. So we have to bring you out to LA, and you're going to have to jump off the roof. And I was like, oh, twist my arm. Yeah. I love jumping off shit. It's like, it's my jam. So I was like, you found the right writer. But it was really cool. And the photo that ended up being, they're like, we need an author shot in the book. And I hate author portraits for the most part. Like I have some that a photographer took that are very nice, but I just don't feel like myself. But this photograph was basically the first time I jumped off the roof. Bruce is like, here, give me your iPhone. And he's a pretty good photographer with an iPhone. And he, did one of those bursts where he shot me jumping all the way into the pool. And it's hilarious because I look like a ninja and my mouth is open. My hair's flying into my mouth. My eyes are bugging out. It's really like not attractive, but it's so me. And so when it came time to, pick an author photo, I was like, I'm sorry, guys, this is, I don't have anything that's better than this. They're like, we love it. And so when Vanity Fair did their excerpt, it's not in the actual magazine, but it's online. And I was like, oh my God.
You look like Spider-Man.
Totally.
You got the arms going back, the knees drawn up to your chest. Like you look like a comic book hero.
Yeah, and that pretty much like that's the authentic me. I'm not like a fancy clothes wearing, like it's really hard for me to learn to walk in heels, and so it just felt kind of perfect. So yeah, but it was fun. And the thing that I've promised my son is that we're going to go to LA in a couple of weeks for the launch party, and he's going to get to jump off the roof. So
nice.
He's so excited.
That's amazing. Well, Kim, I want to be mindful of your time. You're someone I could talk to for 5 hours.
Likewise.
Yeah,
You're so
but
fun to talk
we'll
to.
have to cut turn the faucet off on this one for now. But we'll have to do this more frequently for sure. But I'm so happy that we got to do this for the first time on the mics, and where can people get more familiar with you and your work if they're not already familiar with it?
Well, Google, and I have a website that's kimhcross.com. Have to put the H in, and I'm on the socials, but I'm not very good at them. So, like, you can find me on Twitter, but I really suck at Twitter. So just don't judge.
What a cool person. What a great person to hang with. Kim has introduced me to 2 agents in the last 6 months or so to try to get my foot in the door to publish The Tools of Ignorance, my humble little baseball book. And though both agents have said no, well, one definitely said no, and one is doing the agent thing where they kind of ghost you. It's just part of the game. Whatever. The fact that Kim went out of her way to put me in touch with people and move me up the slush, that should tell you everything you need to know about the kind of person Kim is. While I'm feeling all gooey inside, thanks to West Virginia Wesleyan College's MFA in creative writing for the sport, Casualty of Words, the writing podcast for people in a hurry, dig it, and also, who would I be? What kind of a monster would I be if I wasn't thanking you, the listener? Means the world, CNFers. Hey, when you're a middling writer and podcaster like me, and I suspect there's a chunk of you out there too, that you get it. You know that we live and die by reviews. I always read new ones on the podcast, so if you have a few moments, heck, while the water is boiling for your tea or your coffee, just go over to Apple Podcasts and just peck out a little review. It takes less than 5 minutes. You can also keep the conversation going. Instagram, at Creative Nonfiction Podcast, and Twitter, at CNF Pod, at Brendan O'Mara. I know. Have a good time. The show is partly made possible by the incredible cohort of members at Patreon. Building up the Patreon coffers grants you access to transcripts and audio magazine and coaching. Helps pay for the podcast hosting, which is not cheap. Also keeps the backlog alive so you can go way back and you can see some of the great interviews that took place in the first 100, the second 100. Now we're in the third 100. We're almost coming up to 300, and they stay up there for you to listen to because of the hosting. The show is free, but it ain't cheap. You know what I'm saying? So visit patreon.com/CNFpod. Shop around. Help support the community. Speaking of podcasts, I'm getting my ducks in a row for a new one. I know. Brendan, focus. But this one has more of a purpose. It's going to coincide with the publication, or prior to publication, whenever that might happen, of the memoir, Tools of Ignorance. The podcast will be this. Okay, get ready. The Tools of Ignorance. Conversations from behind the plate. or behind home plate, whereby I get the dirt from the game's best catchers, past and present, about the art and craft of playing catcher, the conversations on the mound with umpires, managers, hitters, game prep, series prep, dealing with starting pitchers and bullpen pitchers. Hat tip to my pal Kevin Wilson, the batting instructor, for opening my eyes to some of these things that an insider would find interesting. So the esoteric stuff, but I think it'll all be of interest to the insiders and fans, who I hope will also dig a pretty cool memoir about baseball, about father, son, about a family broken by divorce. It's a divorce memoir disguised as a baseball book, if you ask me, but that's up to the reader. It'll be broken up into 9-episode seasons, 9 for, innings. I'm reaching out to Johnny Bench right now, Jason Varitek, Pudge Rodriguez, Jorge Posada, and get this, my sister and father for season 1. They were catchers. This will help, I hope, build some roots in the baseball world that should help drive interest in the book. One would hope. So I plan on keeping that podcast like 25 minutes or so. I'm going to try to bank a lot of interviews and produce a bunch and get ahead. Not like the scramble that is the never taking a break with CNF Pod. Such is life. I don't see how that baseball one won't be popular, but I can also see that it might not, despite having really famous people on the show, because I'm not famous, which is, not that I want fame. I would like some, I just want a little bit. Just a little bit, a little juice. And being not famous it's the problem that keeps this podcast from reaching its full potential, in my opinion. It's like if Cheryl Strayed had started a podcast before Wild and before people knew she was Sugar, she'd probably have a middling podcast much like this one. But by middling, I just mean audience size. I think the quality is high, but, if you're not famous enough, it doesn't get in front of enough people, no matter. But because she got memoir famous, she would elevate the status of everyone who visits her show. And so guests would engage and the flywheel would spin and so forth. But the status ballet is tough when you're not famous. Even when you have famous guests on your show, they don't tend to engage because it doesn't really help their status. It might even hurt their status to be associated with a jabroni like me. I see it all the time. It definitely hurts, not going to lie. Like, I'm just like, ugh, I see what you're doing there, and I don't like that, and it hurts. But I know we're doing good work here. Deep down, I know we are. So I keep showing up for you as best I can, because I know this show is hitting the bullseye for a lot of you. And it means the world to me that it means something to you, and that's why I keep showing up. So I hope that's enough. I still hope you get some value from the show as it keeps developing and so forth. You know how when you listen to some other interviews, a Mark Maron interview, that's a WTF interview. I can't even pinpoint what a CNF Pod interview is. Is it breaking down books, analyzing books? Is it the writer's life? It tends to be more like that. I have a hard time pinpointing, I guess, the overarching voice of the show. You think I'd have an idea after nearly 300 of these, but I don't. I truly don't. So that's the journey of it, I suppose. Maybe you can tell me. Maybe you have a better idea than I do. So anyway, I hope the show is still a toe-tapping good time. So toe-tapping? Nah, toe-tapping. So throw up those horns, CNFers. Stay wild. And if you can't do interviews, see ya.